Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. George Russell has responded to Antonelli winning the last 3 consecutive Grand Prix, saying there's no cause for concern on his side of the garage. He's not forgotten how to drive and he's going to come back stronger over the coming rounds. Is that the reality of the situation? Is George more concerned that he's letting on publicly? Montreal was the scene of Russell's first victory last season. Will that be the same story this time? Does he need it to get back on track? Very much enjoyed to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. We're going to start here with something on Max Verstappen. Firstly, he's now had 10 years at Red Bull Racing, 4 regulation sets, 214 Grand Prix. The numbers speak for themselves. But this weekend, you guys might remember this incident, which we didn't, I think, see this in real time, but we did see shortly afterwards Liam Lawson making way down the straight for Max Verstappen. He just led him through, and I thought, a little bit strange, what's going on there? It's not like Lawson had some sort of an issue, so clearly there was a little bit of a moment beforehand. This is how that moment all played out. So going down to the end of the back straight, you can see Max is on the inside of Lawson here, and well, when they get to the apex, this is all the debate. Anyway, if you guys haven't seen this yet, we'll play it kind of frame by frame. This is what you would consider the entry of the corner. This is where the apex is here on screen, and the regulations, I thought, now define that you need to be alongside, at least enough alongside, so we're talking front axle to mirror basically of the respective car on the entry, at the apex and at the exit of the corner. But as you see here, I would argue that we are at this point at the entry. Is Max enough alongside? Maybe it's a slight matter of debate, but maybe it shouldn't even matter because they get to the apex here. You can see that Lawson is very alongside, if not ahead, when they get to the apex. And then when they get to the exit of the track, what you'll see, if you look at the right-hand side, is that Max is very clearly over both of these white lines. So Max is the same thing that happened with Max and Hamilton, right, earlier on. And they went side by side in a very similar way. And it's the similar story, right? Max sends it in really deep. He actually entirely leaves the track, of course, as does Lawson. So then Lawson comes back on and stays ahead, basically, going through the next section. What just confused me about this is I don't really know why Lawson was asked to yield. I don't know what the stewards actually have to say about this, because the stewards never got involved. Racing Bulls just told Lawson to yield a position. So there's been lots of debate about this, whether this was on the regulators or what would the stewards have to say, because as far as I'm concerned, I don't see any reason why Lawson should have to yield this position. Max was, even if he was justified to rim or whatever, he went off the track himself, right? Like, he did not make that pass cleanly in any stretch of the imagination. So I don't understand. People are saying, oh, the regs, like the sporting code is still like just completely ruined. We've got to change it. But like, the stewards never got involved. It's just Racing Bulls told Lawson to yield. So it's like, is that a little bit of what Zach Brown would talk about as A-team, B-team shenanigans need to disappear? Because I can't imagine in a million years Ferrari are telling Hamilton to yield in this kind of similar scenario. But anyway, intrigued to your thoughts on that in the comments. The other update, which is Red Bull related to an extent, we can see their car in the shot, is next year. So the cars are going to change, obviously, as they do every year, but how much of the regulation is going to change? The race put out an interesting video describing how, as far as John Noble sees it, in 2030, maybe a year later, but hopefully 2030, that's when the V8s are going to be back, has been the big rumour of the last few days. But we've also talked on this channel, what are the chances of a step change in the engine regulations before we get to that point? Could we increase the fuel flow rates? Because that's the big one, really. The batteries are big, they're heavy, obviously, they're also very thirsty. So one solution, of course, make the batteries less powerful, reduce the kilowattage from 350 on the MGUK down to, 300, 250, maybe 200. But it's kind of a patchwork solution in the sense that you're just reducing the power of the motor so that the battery charge lasts longer, which is a solution, but also it just makes the car slower. We're talking about taking a 1,000 horsepower car down to 750, 800. Just to make it more drivable. It's not an ideal solution, right? The ideal solution is probably, okay, do that, but compensate by making the ICE more powerful, right? Give more juice to the engine, which they could well do. We know that a 1.6 litre V6 turbo can do an awful lot of power. We saw that from the regulations before when it was creating roughly 850 horsepower. Now it's more like 550. A lot of that is in the limited fuel flow that they're allowed to give the engine this year. The fuel fuel tanks are set, the size that they are, so you can't just tell the teams, all right, like run more fuel through your engines and off you go. Maybe they could do that in qualifying, but you can't really do that for the season, so it's not a solution, and the engines are obviously not been designed to run at that higher fuel flow rate, so that would create a load of reliability concerns as well. The question is, when's that going to change? Because it probably will change, but will it change in time for 2027? John Noble, as far as he understands, some teams, they want to carry their chassis over, or they want to, for cost cap reasons, they want to carry certain things over, which means changing the size of the fuel tank isn't really too much of an option. But to make this change for 2028 would not require many manufacturers to support it. So that right now is a plausible timeline, that we have what we have for this season. We will make tweaks and changes to the rules where we can. 2028, there will be some sort of hardware change to increase the relative strength of the combustion engine compared to the battery. Not probably radically. It's not going to go back to 85-15, but probably somewhere in the middle. Then in 2030, hopefully we're back to a V8 turbo. Maybe I'd prefer it naturally aspirated, but let's say it's a turbo with a slight electrical component. Maybe we're closer then to 15, 20, 10%, something in that ballpark, right? So that's the timeline. But of course we have issues, especially because these cars are only going to get quicker with further aerodynamic upgrades, which means the car is even harder to drag through the air, and as a result, the battery uses the same juice but creates less speed. So that's not exactly ideal. The solution, it appears, that the regulators are looking at, and even I think Tombazis said this, he was like, the cars are quicker than we thought. And again, somehow the FIA underestimates the engineers in terms of the downforce they're able to generate. But they're looking at the speeds of these cars and the speed they're carrying through the high speed, medium speed, especially corners. And the FIA are quite surprised. They were not expecting the cars to be this fast, to have this much downforce this early in the regulation set. And as a result, it's making the engine problem even worse, right? Because especially not just in terms of, okay, you've got more downforce, that means more drag, therefore down the straight, it's harder for, you've got to work harder to get the same results. But equally, if you're going faster through the corners, that's less recharge, that's less opportunities to replenish the battery. So it's kind of a double whammy effect here. And the FIA kind of needed to nail this, really, if the regulations were going to work, but they haven't. So it appears the solution for next year is actually just to make the car slower, right? Because if we can't change the engines radically immediately, then what we can probably tweak is the aero rules. This is, I think, why we've seen all this talk about getting rid of the blown diffuser, or the FTM, that they call it on the back of that Ferrari, and other teams have now copied this as well. That's probably going to go, because the FIA want to, as a result of energy management, it's the same reason why we have the active aero, is because of a flaw in the engine regulations, but they're looking to reduce the downforce of next year's cars, and actually make next year's cars slower than this year's cars. But if it patches over successfully some of the cracks in these engine regulations, then I suppose that's okay. That is a rumour anyway as to what the plan is going to be over the next couple of years. We do have a couple of Red Bull and Ferrari things to discuss. This, of course, is a nice little side-by-side here between the Macarena wings on those two respective cars, the way that they came up with their idea. Interestingly enough, Ferrari's top speed this weekend was actually no better with respect to the best than it had been any time this season. Look, there's obviously plenty of factors when it comes to top speed. One of them is engine, and we know that other teams have done a better job in that regard, most notably even Red Bull. So Ferrari's engine needs work, we'll get back to that. Wache and Red Bull, they have further upgrades on the way. Let's not forget there was talk, China really, that this was the worst chassis Red Bull had ever built, and that seemed justified on the first 3 rounds. But all of a sudden, Max is a 10th off pole in Miami with a car that we still think is probably 2/10 overweight. So it was a massive turnaround for Red Bull. Of course, Mercedes have more to come as well. They didn't bring a massive package in Miami. There is more to come. But it looks like more on the way for Red Bull as well. And look, the car was, I wonder what the car would have been able to do, the Red Bull. We know what it was doing in the sprint. It was very strong. Max was the fastest guy on track pretty much at the end of the sprint. And in the main race, Max spun early, Hadjar put it in the wall. But yeah, who knows what that car was really capable of, at least around that circuit. I suppose we'll see how it fares in Montreal. There's more packages, of course, coming later in the season as well. The big rumour is Austria. Of course, the Red Bull Ring, where they're looking to bring a further weight reduction package. So I guess we'll see whether they can bring that successfully, and if they can, then they could get down to the minimum weight. There could be another, because they unlocked about 0.2 of a second in Miami, just pure, clean time because the car was less heavy, right? That's the ideal way to bring time, really, because it's not going to have any other, you would think, negative consequences. That's the plan. Hit the weight limit by Austria. Further upgrades on the way. They've been working on that Macarena wing since November. Ferrari tried it first. Arguably, it's worked better for Red Bull. On the Ferrari side, they have more to come in terms of their power unit. This is now where the key discussion leans towards, because I think there's probably more to come from the aero package they brought as well. They felt like they weren't unlocking everything about it, the correlation, and it's a conversation for the coming days probably. But the engine, that needs work. And we think they're going to get access to the Adduo. I'm pretty sure they should be announcing that in the very near future. What the advantage will be for the manufacturers that are significantly off the pace of the Mercedes on the combustion side. The intention is and remains for round 12, which is now going to be the 10th round, basically race 10 in Belgium. There was talk about maybe they could get it earlier, but first of all, they've got to get it approved. Then they've actually got to build the upgraded engine, and that's when it's going to arrive. So it'll be the 10th round of the season as far as we're concerned after the 2 cancellations. Look, if they get Jeddah back at the end of the season, as is rumoured, or there's some sort of other replacement situation going on, that could be extra good for Ferrari to have those races postponed. But the understanding is it's certainly not going to be happening before then, right? So there was talk, okay, could they maybe get it ready right at the start of the European season if it's all approved in time? Probably not. It's obviously still got to be validated and approved by the FIA and all this. But the plan is for the Belgian Grand Prix. That's when the new Ferrari engine, and they will hope a real turning point of the season, is going to arrive. Of course, before then, we've got the likes of Monaco, where victory should still be possible regardless. But of course, far from guaranteed. But let's talk about the championship, because Antonelli leads the way with 100 points, Russell in second at 80, so 20 points behind despite the fact that he won the first Grand Prix of the season. Antonelli then bounced back, and you can look at fortune in Japan, you can even look at fortune in China when Russell had the qualifying problem, but you certainly can't say anything negative about Antonelli for his performance on this final race Sunday, and his speed over Russell all weekend was undeniable, not just in the slow speed corners where he's so prolific, but also the confidence through the medium and the high speed was there for Antonelli, and it wasn't there for Russell around this circuit. Now, George talked about some of the reasons why. Even Toto said it, that, well, it's kind of like Piastri. He didn't say this, but it's similar in nature to what people said about Piastri at the end of last season when he struggled, Mexico, Austin, those rounds with the low grip circuits and all this. And Russell said, look, if it's going to rain, then I like the rain, but if it's going to be dry, I prefer the tracks to be higher grip. And of course, drivers have their preferences, but equally, if you're going to be a world championship winning driver, you've got to be pretty good everywhere. Now, Miami has been a bogey track before, and we know that Antonelli stuck it on pole there for the sprint last year, so I think it was frankly expected that Antonelli would outperform Russell around Miami, but the extent to which he did, that was the key talking point, right? Now, Mercedes obviously are delivering well. They have the best engine. They have maybe not quite the best chassis, but it's certainly not far off. They're doing a killer job operationally as well. I mean, the Antonelli pit stop arguably won him the race. Wasn't just the pit stop, it was the in-lap, it was the out-lap and all that, and the decision from the strategy wall. But still, Mercedes nailed it, right? The 2 stops that they did, absolutely on the money. Not the fastest of the day, but Ferrari, who have been the champions and still have the season's fastest, not even on this list, right? So the Mercedes, both of their stops were absolutely lightning. They're looking a pretty well-oiled machine right now from top to bottom. I'm not going to rage bait you too much with the Aramco power rankings, but I don't think you can really deny that Antonelli, certainly on his Sunday performance, was absolutely stellar and did everything required of him after, again, a bit of a dodgy start, but we are used to that at this point. So Antonelli has got a lot of pressure coming his way, that is for sure. Right now it feels like he's lapping it up, he's living in the moment, and I don't expect that to change quickly. But when it gets to crunch time, it's not like Antonelli is going to have a totally clean season. Even Oscar Piastri, right? We talked about it last year, looked super ice cold, super collected, turned up to Baku, put it in the wall. all of a sudden looked pretty mentally shaky for the next few rounds. Collected it together towards the end of the season, but it was too little too late. This is a list of drivers who have won 3 consecutive Grand Prix. They're ordered, by the way, by who's won the most consecutively. So Max at 10, Vettel at 9. Then you've got Ascari, Schumacher, Rosberg, Brabham, Clark, Mansell, Hamilton, Rindt, Senna, Prost, Damon Hill, Alonso, Button, Fangio, Sterling Moss, Jackie Stewart, Niki Lauda, Alan Jones, Mika Hakkinen, and Oscar Piastri, joined now by Kimi Antonelli. So this is a list of drivers who have won 3 or more consecutive Grand Prix, as I say, ordered as such. The only drivers on here that are not world champions, I think there were some that achieved this on their way to the World Championship, so that's worthy of consideration. Of course, Jochen Rindt is the only posthumous World Drivers' Champion, so that, of course, the case for him. But Sterling Moss, arguably considered, I think almost certainly considered, the greatest driver to never win the Formula 1 World Championship. He's here. And then Oscar Piastri, the other one, still early in his career, could be a championship winner in the future, although maybe 2025 was his only chance. My point is, everyone on this list is either a world champion or should have been or could have been, whatever you want to say, and came very close. So Antonelli now joins this list. Now, I remember saying this in the video I did last year in Miami when he put it on pole for the sprint. I remember saying I'd be surprised if Antonelli ends his career without a world championship. And obviously in hindsight, that feels like a kind of an obvious statement. But I feel like at the time there were questions. Fast forward 12 months, there are no questions about this guy's ability. The question, of course, is whether he can keep this up, whether George Russell feels confident that the experience will tell, and I'm sure that that is true to some degree. I do still think that Antonelli's wheel-to-wheel is more questionable than Russell's. I would not be shocked if Antonelli gets into some incidents this season. I guess we shall see. The point that Toto makes is that actually the concern here is about the Italian press, because as time goes on and as Ferrari, they may get back into the mix, but it may be too little too late by the time their engine upgrade arrives, or whatever you want to say. The question from the Italian press is now really looking at Antonelli as potentially another Italian world champion. And after the football, not qualifying for the World Cup, as Toto says, it's all about Yannick Sinner, a tennis player, and it's all about Andrea Kimi Antonelli. So and even as he says, we're getting tons of requests for his time, for interviews, for all this type of stuff, and he's got to take it in his stride. But I mean, like, the kid's only a teenager, right? Like, there is a lot of pressure starting to rise on his shoulders, and this is why George Russell does not think Antonelli's not away and gone by any means. I think Russell's demeanour after the race was actually pretty solid, but I think that could start to change very quickly, because Russell says, obviously, Antonelli's very talented. He won everything in the junior categories for a reason. That's what he said. He's in a great place. The momentum is with him, but I've experienced myself enough how momentum swings through the year. He went on to say the race results could have been worse. The pace was really poor from my side, but I've got some ideas. I used the last 20 laps as a test, tried out some drastic changes with my driving style and some of the diff and brake settings. And he actually said in a different comment, I think on the same topic, he mentioned that what he did with the diff and the brake balance was actually going closer to what Kimi had done through the weekends, and he felt like that improved performance a lot. But yeah, he's waiting for the next race, which is slightly more normal conditions, he says, maybe 3 practice sessions, although it's not. It's another sprint, I think, in Montreal, isn't it? But maybe he thinks more normal in terms of track conditions, just because Miami is a bit of an outlier in terms of the grip levels. I think that's fair. But he says, look, no major cause for concern. I've not forgotten how to drive. I'm still confident in myself. I've also been there. It's a little bit of a tricky run, but of course, if things happen differently in Japan, it could have been very different. Long way to go. We're going to reassess things over the coming weeks. So I think for now, Russell is taking it in his stride to an extent, but I do think that arguably Antonelli has taken over as the championship favourite now, and that is understandable. I mean, look, let's have a look at last year to compare, because Russell had a great season, all things considered, last year, ended up 4th in the championship. He won, of course, in Canada, where we are going next. He won, of course, in Singapore as well. But Antonelli, despite a solid start to the season and notably a very good finish to the season, apart from Abu Dhabi, when he was 2nd in Brazil, he was 3rd in Vegas, he had a horrific middle stint, as we know, right? In the same way that Oscar Piastri had that awful stint around Azerbaijan, and even the races beyond that, really, he was kind of nowhere in terms of pace. Antonelli last season was 4th, 6th, 6th, 11th, 6th, 6th, and then we went to Europe. He went to Imola, retired, Monaco 18th, Spain retired, Canada on the podium, came 3rd, his first podium, Austria retired, crashed into Max, Great Britain, Silverstone, of course, was also a terrible day, and then 16th in Belgium, 10th in Hungary, 16th in the Netherlands, 9th in Italy. So it was only really once he got out of Europe where things turned around. So I think based on this evidence, look, Antonelli's going to do a better job in Europe this year. That is for sure. But I think for George's side, as I said yesterday, I don't think he should be too concerned until we get to like the middle of the European stint. But Montreal, I think, is going to have to be a hugely important one, because this is where George was incredibly strong last season. We go to Canada. Like, if Antonelli just has the pace again, George will be concerned. I know that then we are going to the European rounds. So, you know, it's Monaco actually just after that. So, yeah, the next few rounds are going to be very important. Of course, all of the rounds have the same amount of points up for grabs. But George says it's not over by any means. Still confident he's going to fight his way back and get the job done. And, of course, Antonelli is going to hit some headwinds at some point in the season. So Russell just needs to make sure that he's, well, right back on it in Canada. Because if Antonelli does it again, I mean, look, the most Grand Prix Hamilton ever won in a row was 5. I think the most Rosberg ever won in a row with Mercedes was 6. And Antonelli's at 3. So I guess we'll see. There's upgrades on the way in Canada as well. But very much into your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.